Hello, everybody. This is going to be 10.2. The West is transformed, and we are going to start with a different kind of primary source right here. This is the grave marker of Lester Moore outside of Tombstone, Arizona, which allegedly is a real tombstone. It says, "Here lies Lester Moore, 4 slugs from a 44, nor no less, no more." Our objectives, we're going to analyze the impact of mining and railroads on the settlement of the West, explain the impact of physical and human geographic factors on the settlement of the Great Plains, analyze treatment of Chinese and Mexican Americans in the West, and discuss why the ways various groups used land in the West and conflicts among these groups as well. So, first, let's talk about mining and the growth of railroads during this time. One of the things that was drawing a lot of people to the West was the idea that they could get rich. And the best way you could get rich, a lot of people thought, was by digging for gold or silver or precious valuables. A lot of mining towns would appear overnight. They would grow, they would form, hundreds of, not thousands of people would move to these towns. And then often these towns were set up very quickly, and they didn't really have much in the way of law. They didn't have much in the way of police or lawyers or judges. And so instead, vigilantes would keep the peace. These are sort of self-appointed law enforcement. They would come in, they would, if you disobeyed the rules, they'd, shoot you instead. Think of the gunslingers that you see in a lot of old Western movies. Guys like Wyatt Earp, who was a sheriff, a lawman, and occasionally a vigilante when it worked for him. And he said once, "Fast is fine, but accuracy is everything. In a gunfight, you need to take your time in a hurry." Now, as these towns became more permanent, at least some of them, these towns would hire marshals and sheriffs, and they would move from wild, lawless vigilantism into civilization and law and order. We also see that churches would spring up, helping with social issues, and thus, slowly, wild western towns were tamed and made civilized. Now, some of these towns became very big, thriving cities. Think Tucson, think Flagstaff, a lot of those Arizona cities. Others only lasted as long as the mines produced something out of them. So once the gold was gone, once the silver was gone, these boom towns would be deserted and they would become ghost towns instead, like the town of Bodie, California, where you can still see the buildings that popped up with the mine, but once the mine was empty, Bodie emptied out as well. Now, the first miners were basically just one person digging in the ground. However, as word spread that there was gold in them hills, big corporations came out and they hired cheap labor from China and Mexico. Now, this required a lot of water, spraying high pressured water at the hills to basically hydraulic mining would more or less uncover the gold by shooting water at the hills. However, the runoff from this hurt farmers and ranchers as the sediment and the pollution from the water runoff hurt their fields. However, the federal government supported big mining because the money that big miners made helped to support American expansion. Now, as the government and private businesses wanted to connect the East Coast to the West Coast, they helped each other out with forming transcontinental railroads. In fact, one big one first, the Transcontinental Railroad. Eventually, two companies, the Central Pacific Company and the Union Pacific Railroads, moved towards each other, each of them building tracks towards each other, and eventually they met. And this was a tough business. They lost people. You're out in the elements. You're blowing holes through mountains. You're working with trains, and so this was relatively dangerous business. However, the incentive was the federal government gave land grants to the railroad companies, promising them cheap land next to the tracks, and then the corporations would sell that land to settlers and make a lot of money off of it. So here are the two big railroads, Central and Union Pacific Railroad companies, building that transcontinental railroad. And they met in Utah at the meeting point right here, Promontory Point, where a golden spike was driven into the ground to memorialize the meeting place of these two great railroads in May of 1869. Now, pretty soon after finishing the railroad, other railroads started to emerge north and south. Why did they go there? Well, they were moving stuff east to west. Primarily beef. Beef was the new big export of the West, and eastern cities were moving stuff to the West as well. Eastern luxuries, stuff you couldn't get out west was moved from New York or Boston or St. Louis into these western towns. And this also helped to expand the West and expand cities and towns. And we see that Easterners, especially down on their luck Easterners who are not having much good fortune out east, flocked to the West in order to make it rich. And so we see that the population booms. 10 states, all of them Western, join from 1864 to 1896. Now let's look at cattle. Another big movement of this time was cattle. Like I said, this was one of the big new exports of the West. Once railroads made it possible to move cattle easily, ranchers started to move west with their cattle herds. So, ranching, especially longhorn cattle, really helped to spur another Western movement where we see ranchers using what's called the open range system, letting their cows just wander around and graze without fences. Ranchers kept track of them by basically burning a symbol onto their cattle with a hot iron. And then once a year, they would sort of round these cattle up and move them towards the big train cities and move them towards Chicago, which is the big slaughterhouse city. Now, we also see that Mexican cowboys were essential to this. Mexican cowboys were called vaqueros, or horsemen. Today, oftentimes, many cowboys are called buckaroo, which is sort of a mispronunciation of vaquero. And in the spring, the cowboys would go out, they would collect these cows and move them back into town and put them on trains and send them east. So here's what a Texas Longhorn looks like with the more modern branding, which is to tag their ears. And this is what an old brand would look like when you basically burn your brand onto the skin of the cow. Now, once the cattle were rounded up, cowboys would put them on a long drive to these railroad towns, and then they would move east to the slaughterhouses. These long drives could take weeks and months, and it was tough. You're living out in the wilderness. You're moving cattle who have a tendency to stampede. There are bandits out there, Native American attacks. It's lonely, dangerous work. It was also much more diverse than you see in the movies, though. Usually, when you see a John Wayne movie like what was it, Red River, I think, where he's moving the cattle to Abilene. Cowboys were mostly white. However, in real life, cowboys were a mix of white and Mexican and African American and everything else in between. So here's a cowboy on the cattle drive. Now, cattle were moved to places like Dodge City, Kansas, and they were put on trains, and the trains moved them east. And these big cities that were sort of the central hubs for moving cattle became known as cow towns. They were also big for outlaw hangouts, and so a lot of these places became part of the mythology of the West, where gunslingers and cowboys would battle each other out, and gunfights at the OK Corral and stuff like that. This did occasionally happen, allegedly happen, but some of it's true, some of it is the mythology of the West. We see cowtown celebrities like Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and other people, including Bill Pickett, a famous African American cowboy who invented the sport of bulldogging, where you jump off your horse and razzle a cow to the ground using only the horns. So here's Bill Pickett, who once said, "I'm promised for this world just so long, and when I go, that will be the end of it. Sometime, I suppose, I'll make a mistake, a fatal mistake, and it'll all be over." And so this is the sport that he created, bulldogging or steer wrestling, where you wrestle a bull to the ground using only its horns, like that, which is something you'll never see me do. Now, open range style cattle ranching lasted for about a decade after the Civil War. However, as more and more people moved west, uh, basically the open range closed up. They didn't have the land anymore to keep an open range because people had settled on that land, and they had fenced in the open ranges and put up barbed wire. And also, the overabundance of beef led to a drop in the demand for beef. They had too much beef, basically. And lastly, the thing that kind of killed off the open range was a series of really bad winters that killed many herds of cattle and sort of brought it down to uh, smaller sizes. So here's barbed wire, probably one of the most important inventions in the history of the western United States. It changed it from being an open range system to a small farm system instead. And so this is another Remington painting. This is the second one I think we've had in chapter 10, called The Fall of the Cowboy, where we see that these fences that are going up stop the open range system right here. Now, let's look at farmers settling the plains. The Great Plains of Middle America were the last section to be filled up by white people during this time, white settlers moving west. But the railroads made it so that they could move west. And so we see that this farmable land was easy to get to, it was relatively cheap. We also see that many immigrants moved west looking for a place to start a new start without prejudice. So here's the Great Plains right here. Everything in green is considered the Great Plains. Now, at first, people just kind of settled west and moved west and squatted on whatever land they could find. However, they had no rights to this land, but when people are moving into open territory, nobody really cared. It wasn't until 1862 with the Homestead Act that people started to care. During the Homestead Act, the federal government sold plots of land to people for very low prices. Now, the one thing you had to do was, if you were going to move on to this land, you had to live there for up to 5 years and somehow improve it by digging wells and building roads and things like that. Now, the Homestead Act helped to close up what we call the frontier, this sort of open territory of the West. This settlement of the frontier also led to women moving west, which was something that we hadn't seen a lot of at that time. Most of the people moving west were men at that time. Now we have women and families moving west as well. Some of these new settlers were former slaves as well. We see a movement of what are called exodusters, where African Americans moved west because honestly, the South is not a great place to live for them at this time. And so a lot of them move west. They're called exodusters, by the way, because of the book of Exodus, where Israelites moving out of slavery into the Promised Land. Here are some exodusters in the West in 1897. Now, life was tough out in the Great Plains. We've heard about the cattle drives being bad, but, just making a go of it was hard. Winters were bad, droughts were bad. There were occasional literal plagues of bugs like locusts going around. Also, there weren't many trees, meaning that if you wanted to build a house, you're not going to be able to build it out of wood. And so they made it out of dirt. A lot of these original houses are called sod houses or soddies, which, imagine building a house made of dirt probably doesn't do very well in a rainstorm. It also lets in some of the wildlife as well. They're known that snakes would make their way into sod houses like this quite often. Now, settlers would fence off their property with barbed wire. They would plow with big steel plows, and they would try to keep out open range livestock. They also would tap underground water to water their crops. Now, a lot of these farmers were sent packing by the tough living of the Midwest. Those who stayed would modernize and mechanize in order to make their farms successful. Now, let's look at minorities on the Great Plains and in the West as well. Like I said, it was diverse out west. You don't see it in a lot of those movies like Rio Bravo or Red River or anything like that, but this was a very diverse native place. So we have Native Americans, Asian Americans, Mexican Americans, African Americans, and they made up 80% of the Great Plains. However, they were still seen as sort of other and outside. So we have Chinese people who were treated with hostility. They came here to work in the mines and to work in the big cities. They were often attacked by mobs of whites, and eventually Congress actually said, we're not going to take any more new Asian American immigrants. They passed what's called the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which stopped any further Chinese immigration to America, and we didn't get rid of that act until the 1940s. The Supreme Court actually upheld the Chinese Exclusion Act, saying that basically the 14th Amendment was meant for American people, not immigrant people. They did offer some help to Chinese Americans who were born here, though, passing judgments that basically said that America could not strip Chinese Americans of their land or their citizenship when they were here already. So here is a very blatantly anti-Asian political cartoon from the time where the Asian devil is being kept out by this giant exclusion fence. So yeah, this cartoon's quite a bit right here. Now, Mexican Americans whose ancestors had once owned this land back when Mexico and Spain had owned this territory were also rather unwelcome. Even Mexican Americans who had been guaranteed their land after the Mexican American War were still being pushed off their land, with claims that they had no documentation of this land being theirs. And the law was on the side of the white ranchers in this time period. Now, there's also groups of Mexican Americans would sort of band together to try to defend whatever rights they had left in the American West. Groups like Las Gorras Blancas, the White Hats, would target white-owned property. So this is almost like vigilantes going after vigilantes a little bit. They cut down white fences. They burned white houses. These groups were also supported by labor groups like the Knights of Labor. In 1894, Hispanic Americans in Tucson created the what's called the Alianza, which is a group that was meant to protect Mexican American heritages and culture, and also to protect their rights too. So protect their history, but also protect their legality. They also provided self-defense for these groups. The Alianza expanded further across the country during this time. Lastly, let's look at struggles and change across the West. So, there was a big war in the West over who got to use the land, who got to use the grazing land, who got to use the resources. We had farmers and cattle ranchers and miners, and everybody's trying to get the upper hand. Everybody wants to get the resources. Everybody especially wants to get the water. Water was necessary for everything from drinking to bathing to feeding and watering your cattle to, growing crops to, hydraulic mining. They all required water, and water is not exactly easily obtainable in the West either. Finally, the last little bit of frontier was sold off in 1889. By 1890, the census said there is no more frontier left. This is when the government opened up the Oklahoma Territory. Many farmers found that the best land had already been taken by people who got there early, who were called Sooners, and they had illegally set up farms. And by the way, Sooner is still what they call people from Oklahoma, especially their sports teams. By 1890, there was no more frontier left. We had conquered America from sea to sea. However, the country would still see fights over things like ethnicity, rights to land, and especially the right to water in the West. That would continue. But also, the mythology of the West would continue to be very important. We'll talk about that in class.